Freire cites Fromm, and Fromm discusses this idea of necrophilic behavior. And basically all necrophilic behavior is, it's sort of this death drive, this drive to eradicate ourselves. It's sort of self-destructive. It's not sort of self-destructive, it is self-destructive. And we recognize now that the death drive ties into this prior concept that Freire had of self-deprecation, which I said at the beginning of the video, right? The whole idea is the oppressor institutes a system wherein the oppressed self-deprecate, willfully demoralize themselves through this process of self-deprecation. And that idea of self-deprecation leads to what Fromm calls necrophilic behavior. So insofar as this horizontal violence is me versus you, and we're both members of the oppressed, then everywhere I go, everything I see is submersion, violence, death. My interpretation, my understanding of reality, and this is true to myself now that I think about it, this really is true to myself. In my formative years, my understanding of reality was exactly that. It's sad to say it, but it's true, and you know, it caught me off guard. It's abuse, domination, violence, death. That's how you come to understand the world. I mean, that would make sense why I ended up in genocide studies, right? Why I'm doing liberation theory, right? Because it's an attempt to overcome that stigma, right? So this necrophilic behavior drives members of the community to kill each other off, right? Because all of their anger is misdirected through this horizontal violence, right? All of this anger has to manifest in something, and all of this violence has to manifest in something, and what else can violence manifest in? The greatest instantiation of the manifestation of violence is death, right? So it's not a theoretical death drive. It is death. It is the destruction of communities, right? Within the community by members of the community, right? So this horizontal violence then, right? This horizontal violence leads to the necrophilic behavior, right? So horizontal violence leads to necrophilic behavior. And this necrophilic behavior becomes problematic, right? Because this idea of necrophilic behavior is a drive that collapses the society. It destroys the society, and it perpetrates self-extermination, self-deprecation. All the while, the oppressor is casually just watching along. Look at these fools kill themselves. Look at these fools slaughter themselves, right? And while they're slaughtering themselves, the very fact that we could kill each other, right? Think about this. The very fact that we, as members of the oppressed group, can kill each other is a consequence of believing that we are ignorant, that we don't have knowledge, that we aren't any good, that we are primarily felons, criminals, that we aren't, we don't have the possibility to be meaningful contributors and members to society. Once you ascribe that, right, once you subscribe to that belief, horizontal violence is necessary. And once horizontal violence takes hold within a community, you can guarantee that that community is going to self-exterminate. It's going to implode, right? So, in a sense, then, we see that suffering will lead to, right, the imposition of suffering, the strategic imposition of suffering by the oppressor, the strategic imposition of suffering by the oppressor on members of an oppressed population will result in the willful killing of members of their own community, right? And I think, you know, in another series that I'm doing on the philosophy of hip-hop, this is extremely true in African-American contemporary black community. All the rappers are talking about killing each other, right? Killing you, we're going to kill each other, right? I'm gonna kill that nigga when I see him, right? Pardon my French, but that's the idea. And I hear a lot of people in the community talking that. The fact that one black man could look to another black man and say, I want to kill him because of whatever ridiculous idea, I want to kill him. He looked at me wrong, he's wearing the wrong colors, he's disrespecting whatever it might be, means that we have a very profound sense of horizontal violence, which is a consequence of that suffering. And that suffering is ultimately imposed on members of the community. And it takes those very same members to redirect that violence, to redirect that anger away from members of their own community towards the very origin of our mutual oppression. Once that's done, then then we can emancipate ourselves. The last section then in this discussion, is what Freire calls instruments of domestication, right? And I think this is just a great idea, right? Instruments of domestication. So think of it like this, right? The question is, if you're going to bake a cake, what are the things that you need to bake a cake? Well, you might need eggs, you might need water, you might need milk, you might need a pot of some baking dish, an oven, heat, icing, blah, 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 blah. You need these things. All of these things are preconditions to the final product, and the final product being a cake. So that all of these things, in their sort of amalgamation, in their combination, create this final product, the cake. Well, instruments of domestication, these instruments to domesticate a population, to pacify a population, Chinua Achebe talks about the pacification of populations. This obviously hampers, suppresses discourse. It suppresses the desire to liberate a population, right? So this idea of domestication is antithetical to liberation, right? It's what I would call inauthentic discourse, right? Inauthentic discourse happens where I don't genuinely want you to be liberated, but I'll entertain your conversation, right? So the whole while you're talking about it, I'm not really thinking about motivating or contributing to the group emancipation, because I recognize that that's going to undermine my power. Some of the things that and I think these are interesting, I'll write it down. Some of the instruments of domestication, one, monologue. A monologue is an instrument of domestication. Somebody goes up there and gives a big, huge speech, right? It's an instrument of domestication. I have to admit, what I'm doing right now, in a sense, is an instrument of domestication. Not entirely, because it's, Freire didn't write in a time, he didn't write this in a time for the internet. So, things are changing. Globalization has changed things quite considerably. But the very fact that YouTube allows you to make comments, I would argue, doesn't make this a monologue. I hope it's a dialogue. It's just a very weird dialogue, right? You have to do a video response to the video, and then, we email back and forth, and you text and I text, and you leave a comment and I respond. But insofar as we're doing that, it's not a monologue, right? There is a problem, and I do that with many of you, right? We have a dialogue. So I'll take that back. This isn't a monologue. But a genuine monologue where I talk and you listen, and that's it, it's an instrument of domestication. Again, it's this fromness. I have information that comes from me to you. I'm active, you're passive. I know, you don't know. And this is back to what we were saying before. This is exactly what we're trying to change. We don't want to assume that's valid, because it's not. Slogans. Little catchphrases, right? Right? Slogans. Slogans are instruments of domestication. Freire has nothing nice to say for slogans. Slogans, what do slogans do? They domesticate you. They pacify you. They tell you where you should be, when you should be there, how you ought to exist. So slogans. Rants. And I'm not going to write them all down. Rants. Adages. All of these things are instruments of domestication. The whole point of this is that insofar as I avoid step number 2, remember, in a discussion of praxis, 3 things you need to have. The first thing that you have to have is critical reflection, or just reflection. The second thing that you have to have is critical dialogue. If I avoid critical dialogue by just having a bunch of monologues that I give, a bunch of speeches that I give, if I avoid critical dialogue by just putting out a catchy slogan, oh, for the people, it's whatever it is, catchy slogans, all of this avoid. They create an inhibition, a block between genuine critical dialogue. Insofar as I undermine critical dialogue, I can never get to revolution, right? So the whole idea of these instruments of domestication is to undermine revolution. And how do you undermine revolution? You undermine it by not even allowing the audience to actually engage in the discourse. It just becomes me telling you what to do, right? The government tells us that we need to do this, and we say, okay, let's do it because the government said so. And then the last point is that the use of language to speak for, right? The use of language to speak for the oppressed transforms them into the masses, right? If we assume and we try to implement these instruments of domestication, then insofar as I have a monologue, right, and I'm an individual in power, and I'm giving you this monologue, or I'm touting these slogans, and what you do is that you tout these same you basically do the same monologue, and you tout the same slogans, then you have done absolutely nothing new. I say a monologue, I give the catchy slogan, and during election time, you see this all the time, right? Everybody in every election, not even just the United States and the world, they want to come up with these catchy phrases, right? This catchy slogan, it's just so catchy. And then all the members of the population say the catchy slogans, and they go around like good sheep, right? Saying what they were told to say, right? This is a model of oppression. This is a model of subordination. This is a model of indoctrination. This is a model of domestication, right? This model where I say it and then you say it because I said it is you gaining the directive from me. As I said earlier in the video, when my daughter comes to me and asks me if she goes outside and I say no, and she asks for a justification why, if I say because I said so, if the justification for sort of the purpose of the slogan is because it came from me and I'm the authority, so you should believe that it's true, if that's the case, right, then it's a sad state of affairs. It could be the case that I've never read a word in Freire's book, right? It could be the case that I've never opened this book, right? You should be checking to make sure that what I'm telling you is actually Freire, right? If you don't check, right, if you don't read this to see whether or not what I'm saying is actually what he's saying, if my interpretations are close or at least charitable to what Freire is saying, then your whole interpretation of Freire becomes my interpretation of Freire. Now think about it. If I was the bad philosopher, right, then it could be that I could deliberately create a situation in which I know all of these young students and all these graduate students are going to go into YouTube and type in Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and they're going to see my videos on Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And no one else has done it the way that I'm going to do it. And now everybody's going to have this interpretation of Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is my interpretation. This is my interpretation of Freire, right? What you need to do is you need to read Freire for yourself, right? And establish your own interpretation. If you don't, and I'm not trying to belittle the audience, but it's true, and I have to remain true to Freire. If you don't, if all you do is take what I say, my slogans, my monologue of Freire, and you espouse exactly what I said, then I have failed and you have failed, right? This is not what I'm trying to do. What I want you to do is I want you to take what I've said of Freire, what I've told you of Freire, and I want you to read it for yourself and then say, hey, Dr. Campbell, that wasn't what I thought. Actually it's, and then what ends up happening? Well, you end up elevating, right? There isn't this imbalance between teacher and student, right? It's, I read Freire, and what you said, your interpretation of, the objective transformation of reality, I think it's good, but here's what I think you could have incorporated, or here's where I think you might have misunderstood what he was saying, based on my experience, blah, 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 blah. If you just take what I say and run with it and assume that it's fact, then we've both failed. What you need to recognize is that my interpretation is but one interpretation of Freire, and without you grabbing this book, reading it yourself, then your interpretation is my interpretation. So we should engage in this critical discourse. I think that expresses the point clearly. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my interpretation of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Until next time, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Thanks and goodbye.